Rowan Sterling's Mont Blanc trembled above the bankruptcy papers, his $2.8 billion empire reduced to legal jargon at 4:47 a.m. The all-night diner hummed with fluorescent desperation as he prepared to sign away everything, until the tired waitress with paint-stained apron froze mid-coffee pour. "Wait." Sage Reeves squinted at the documents scattered across the cracked vinyl booth, her community college accounting classes screaming red flags at numbers that made no sense. "Sir, this liquidation figure, it's showing your tech patents as worthless. But didn't TechRise just announce a breakthrough using your exact algorithms?" The billionaire's bloodshot eyes snapped up. In 72 hours, he'd trusted lawyers, advisors, board members. None had caught what this exhausted art student spotted in 30 seconds. The fountain pen clattered to Formica as Rowan Sterling realized he wasn't signing bankruptcy. He was signing his own corporate murder. The mahogany table that had hosted trillion-dollar deals now felt like a funeral pyre beneath Rowan Sterling's trembling hands. Jasper Ryland's voice cut through the executive conference room like a scalpel through flesh, each word dismantling 20 years of empire building with surgical precision. The CFO's presentation slides glowed accusingly on the wall-mounted screen, crimson numbers bleeding across quarterly projections that looked more like a coroner's report than a financial summary. Rowan's empire, Cybernexus, the crown jewel of Silicon Valley innovation that had revolutionized quantum computing algorithms, was hemorrhaging money faster than a severed artery. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same boardroom where he'd once celebrated Forbes covers and IPO bells now witnessed his corporate execution. And he wondered if the anonymous commenters watching this unfold from their offices around the world could sense the magnitude of what was crumbling in real time. The numbers swam before Rowan's vision like accusatory phantoms, each percentage point of decline a nail in his professional coffin. Patent licensing revenues that once flowed like digital rivers had mysteriously dried up overnight, major contracts evaporating as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burning dreams and the hollow echo of Jasper's clinical delivery. The man who'd helped build Cybernexus from a garage startup into a technological titan now read Rowan's destruction with the emotional detachment of a meteorologist reporting tomorrow's weather. Board members shifted uncomfortably in Italian leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, their faces masks of practiced neutrality that barely concealed the vulturous anticipation lurking beneath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with mechanical indifference, casting harsh shadows across documents that detailed the systematic dismantling of everything Rowan had sacrificed his youth, his relationships, and his soul to build. Camden Whitmore's voice crackled through the conference phone speakers with the authority of a man who'd navigated corporate disasters for 3 decades, his tone carrying just enough gravitas to convince everyone in the room that he was their salvation rather than their destroyer. The lawyer's words painted a grim picture of legal obligations and fiduciary responsibilities, weaving a narrative of inevitable collapse that made bankruptcy seem not just advisable, but legally mandated. Rowan found himself nodding along to his own destruction, hypnotized by Whitmore's masterful rhetoric that transformed catastrophic failure into prudent business strategy. The Mont Blanc pen in Rowan's jacket pocket felt heavier with each passing minute, as if the weight of his impending signature was already pulling him toward the ocean floor of corporate obscurity. What struck him most was Whitmore's calm demeanor, the way the lawyer discussed liquidation assets with the same enthusiasm most people reserved for weekend golf plans, never once suggesting alternatives or questioning the sudden appearance of financial difficulties that had materialized like storm clouds on a clear day. The board's vote came swift and merciless, a unanimous decision that felt choreographed in its efficiency, as if the directors had rehearsed this moment in secret meetings Rowan had never been invited to attend. 23 years of building relationships, fostering loyalty, and creating shared prosperity evaporated in less than 23 seconds of raised hands and murmured affirmations. The motion to remove him as CEO passed with the clinical precision of a surgical amputation, leaving Rowan to wonder when exactly he'd become a liability rather than an asset to the company that bore his creative DNA in every line of code. He watched his former allies avoid eye contact with the practiced skill of seasoned politicians. their earlier promises of support crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. The security escort arrived before the meeting officially adjourned. Two men in black suits who looked apologetic but determined, their presence transforming Rowan from company founder to potential threat in the span of a heartbeat. The elevator ride to the ground floor felt like a descent into purgatory, each passing floor marker counting down the floors of his former kingdom until he reached street level as nothing more than another Silicon Valley casualty. The security guards maintained professional courtesy as they escorted him through the lobby he'd designed himself, past the quantum computing display that showcased his revolutionary algorithms, beyond the inspirational quotes etched in marble that he'd selected during more optimistic times. The revolving door spun him onto the sidewalk with mechanical indifference, depositing him into the pre-dawn darkness of San Francisco like unwanted cargo. The city hummed with its usual technological fervor, startup energy crackling through the air as young entrepreneurs pursued their own Silicon Valley dreams, blissfully unaware that their hero had just been cast out of his own digital kingdom. Rowan stood on the pavement where he'd once commanded an empire, watching early commuters hurry past with their coffee and confidence, none of them recognizing the dethroned king bleeding invisibly among them. 3 hours of aimless wandering through fog-shrouded streets brought him to Mel's all-night diner, a fluorescent oasis of grease and caffeine that catered to the city's insomniacs, shift workers, and broken dreams. The neon sign buzzed with electrical imperfection, casting intermittent shadows across cracked concrete that reflected Rowan's fractured mental state with poetic accuracy. Inside, the smell of bacon and desperation mingled with the mechanical hum of industrial coffee makers and the soft conversation of people who'd found themselves awake when the rest of the world slept. Booth seats cracked with age, and countless stories welcomed him with their worn vinyl embrace, offering sanctuary for anyone whose life had taken an unexpected detour into darkness. The waitress behind the counter moved with practiced efficiency, her paint-stained apron suggesting an artistic soul trapped in service industry survival, her tired eyes holding the wisdom of someone who'd seen enough late-night breakdowns to recognize another soul in crisis. This was where titans fell and ordinary heroes rose, where bankruptcy papers would soon meet coffee stains, and where the most important conversation of Rowan Sterling's life was about to unfold in ways neither participant could possibly anticipate. Sage Reeves had perfected the art of invisible observation during 3 years of night shifts at Mel's diner, her trained eyes cataloging the human wreckage that washed ashore between midnight and dawn like a sociologist studying urban decay in real time. The graveyard shift attracted a specific ecosystem of broken souls. Cab drivers nursing bitter coffee between fares, hospital workers decompressing from trauma-filled shifts, insomniacs wrestling with demons that only emerged in darkness, and occasionally men in $1,000 suits who'd clearly lost more than their way. Tonight's specimen sat hunched in booth 7, his Italian leather shoes incongruous against cracked linoleum, his Armani jacket wrinkled like expensive origami that someone had tried unsuccessfully to unfold. She'd recognized him immediately from the Forbes magazine covers that decorated the break room bulletin board, though the confident smile and steel-gray eyes from those photographs had been replaced by the hollow stare of someone watching his world implode in slow motion. Rowan Sterling, tech billionaire and quantum computing pioneer, now looked like any other casualty of American capitalism, just with better accessories and a more expensive backstory. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory as Sage approached the booth with coffee pot in hand. Irish wisdom passed down through generations that had survived famines, immigrations, and economic collapses with nothing but stubbornness and shrewd observation skills. "Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, darling," Nana O'Malley had always said. "You'll learn more in 5 minutes of watching than most people learn in 5 years of talking." The advice had served Sage well through community college accounting classes, family diner management crises, and the delicate social navigation required to survive in a world that often dismissed working-class intelligence as irrelevant background noise. She'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read financial distress in people's posture, having spent countless evenings helping her grandfather balance books for their family's now-defunct restaurant, learning to spot discrepancies and irregularities with the instinctive precision of a financial bloodhound. The skill had proven invaluable during her art studies, where she'd supplemented scholarship funds by tutoring fellow students in basic accounting principles, translating complex financial concepts into digestible wisdom that could save creative souls from drowning in debt and mismanagement. The documents spread across Sterling's table caught her attention like alarm bells in a quiet library, their official letterhead and urgent formatting screaming legal crisis to anyone trained to read between corporate lines. Sage had seen enough bankruptcy paperwork during her family's restaurant collapse to recognize the distinctive layouts and terminology that accompanied financial destruction, the clinical language that reduced human dreams to asset liquidation schedules and creditor payment hierarchies. What made her pause mid-pour was the sheer scope of numbers involved, figures that seemed to describe the dismantling of an empire rather than the simple closure of a failed business venture. Her accounting classes had covered corporate restructuring in theoretical terms, but seeing billions of dollars reduced to legal jargon felt like witnessing archaeological destruction, as if someone was systematically erasing civilization's technological progress one patent at a time. The coffee pot trembled slightly in her grip as she processed the implications of what she was inadvertently witnessing, the weight of accidental knowledge settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat she hadn't asked to wear. Sterling's appearance triggered a complex emotional response that Sage struggled to categorize as she refilled his cup for the third time in an hour, watching him study documents with the desperate intensity of someone searching for hope in hopeless circumstances. Part of her felt genuine sympathy for any human being experiencing such obvious distress, regardless of their financial status or previous success, because pain was pain whether it wore designer suits or thrift store uniforms. Another part of her bristled with working-class resentment at the sight of someone who'd probably never wondered how to stretch $20 across a week of groceries, now expecting the universe to rescue him from consequences that ordinary people faced without safety nets or golden parachutes. Yet underneath these competing impulses lay something more complex. Professional curiosity about the financial mechanisms that could topple someone so thoroughly insulated by wealth and power. Academic fascination with the numbers that could reduce a technological empire to paperwork scattered across a diner table. The internal conflict made her hands shake slightly as she poured coffee, caught between the desire to offer comfort and the intellectual compulsion to understand exactly how such comprehensive destruction was possible. The other late-night customers treated her with the casual dismissiveness that service workers learn to expect, their interactions ranging from polite indifference to barely concealed condescension that made her feel like animated furniture rather than a human being with thoughts, dreams, and capabilities. The businessman in booth 3 snapped his fingers when he wanted more coffee, never making eye contact or acknowledging her existence beyond her utility as a caffeine delivery system, his behavior illustrating the invisible caste system that governed American service interactions. The hospital worker in booth 1 spoke to her phone throughout their meal, never pausing their conversation to thank Sage for food delivery or acknowledge her presence with even basic courtesy, treating the entire transaction as if coffee appeared through magical automation rather than human labor. These microaggressions had become so routine that Sage barely registered them consciously, though they accumulated like paper cuts to her dignity. Constant reminders that her intelligence and potential were irrelevant to people who saw only her uniform and assumed limitations. The contrast with Sterling's polite, if distracted, acknowledgement of her service felt almost jarring in its basic decency, making her wonder if crisis had a humanizing effect on people previously insulated from ordinary social interactions. Her shift supervisor, Danny, watched her hover near booth 7 with the suspicious attention of someone who'd seen too many waitresses get distracted by seemingly sympathetic customers who turned out to be predators or con artists. "Girl needs to keep her distance from trouble," he'd mutter under his breath whenever he caught her lingering too long near any particular table, his protective instincts shaped by 3 decades of witnessing the various ways that late-night encounters could go wrong for young women working alone. The diner's informal policy discouraged excessive fraternization with customers, a rule born from experience with situations that had escalated beyond professional boundaries into harassment, stalking, or worse complications that management preferred to avoid entirely. But Sterling didn't feel dangerous in the conventional sense. His desperation seemed too genuine, his distress too consuming to mask predatory intent, though Sage acknowledged that her intuition had been wrong before about people who'd seemed harmless until they weren't. The tension between curiosity and caution created an internal dialogue that made concentration difficult, her mind ping-ponging between professional obligations and intellectual fascination with the financial mystery unfolding in real time before her trained eyes, wondering if intervention was wisdom or foolishness, kindness or recklessness. The numbers didn't add up, and Sage's accounting-trained mind latched onto discrepancies like a detective spotting blood spatter at a crime scene that everyone else had dismissed as accidental paint. She'd initially approached Sterling's table with simple humanitarian concern, offering coffee refills to someone clearly experiencing a personal crisis, but the document spread before him told a story that defied basic financial logic with almost aggressive implausibility. Patent portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars were listed as completely worthless, despite recent tech industry announcements that suggested otherwise, while licensing agreements that should have generated steady revenue streams appeared to have vanished into thin air without explanation. The liquidation schedule read like someone had systematically devalued every valuable asset while inflating every possible liability, creating a financial portrait that resembled corporate sabotage more than legitimate business failure. Her grandmother's voice whispered caution in her ear, warning against getting involved in rich people's problems that could swallow working-class good intentions without leaving a trace. But her professional integrity as a future accountant demanded she at least point out obvious errors that could destroy someone's life through pure negligence. Sterling's bloodshot eyes focused on her face with laser intensity when she mentioned the patent discrepancies, his expression shifting from polite dismissal to sharp attention as if she'd just spoken a foreign language he hadn't expected her to understand. The transformation was almost cinematic in its completeness, businessman personas dissolving to reveal raw desperation and faint hope struggling against overwhelming defeat like flowers pushing through concrete. His questions came rapid fire as he realized she wasn't just making conversation, but had actually read and comprehended complex financial documents that most people would dismiss as incomprehensible legal gibberish. "You understand liquidation schedules?" he asked with the incredulity of someone discovering that their waitress held advanced degrees in nuclear physics, his voice carrying undertones of class-based assumptions being violently readjusted in real time. The implication stung, even as Sage recognized it as unintentional, his surprise revealing how thoroughly people like him had compartmentalized intelligence according to job titles and social positions, never imagining that intellectual capability could exist outside their narrow professional circles. Camden Whitmore's voice on the emergency conference call carried the smooth authority of someone who'd built a career, convincing people that his interpretations of complex situations were not only correct, but inevitable. His tone managing to be simultaneously reassuring and dismissive in ways that made questioning his expertise feel like personal weakness rather than due diligence. The lawyer's explanations flowed with practiced ease as he addressed each discrepancy Sage had identified, weaving technical jargon and market volatility into a narrative that transformed obvious errors into unfortunate but unavoidable consequences of economic forces beyond anyone's control. "These valuations reflect current market conditions," Whitmore explained with the patience of someone educating a child, his voice carrying subtle implications that questioning professional assessments revealed ignorance rather than insight. But Sage's training had taught her to listen for what wasn't said as much as what was, and Whitmore's responses felt like elaborate deflections designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Answers that addressed her questions without actually answering them in ways that reminded her of politicians explaining away scandals with technically true but fundamentally misleading statements. The subtle intimidation began almost immediately after Sage voiced her concerns, Whitmore's tone shifting from patronizing patience to barely concealed hostility as he realized she wouldn't be easily dismissed or silenced with technical jargon and professional authority. His questions about her qualifications came wrapped in false courtesy that couldn't disguise their underlying threat. Implications that interfering with legal proceedings she didn't understand could have serious consequences for someone in her precarious position. "I'm sure you mean well," he said with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But financial matters of this complexity require professional expertise that takes years to develop." The message was clear. Stay in your lane. Know your place. Remember that people like you don't question decisions made by people like us. But the veiled threats only strengthened Sage's conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. Her Irish stubbornness responding to bullying with increased determination rather than submission. Generations of working-class defiance flowing through her veins like genetic programming that refused to bow to authority simply because it wore expensive suits and spoke with entitled confidence. Sterling's growing agitation during the call suggested he was finally recognizing patterns that desperation had previously obscured. His questions becoming sharper and more pointed as Sage's observations gave him new frameworks for interpreting Whitmore's reassurances and deflections. The billionaire's transformation from defeated victim to suspicious investigator happened gradually but visibly. His posture straightening and his voice gaining strength as legitimate doubt replaced blind trust in professional relationships. "Walk me through the chip flow announcement again," he demanded, his tone carrying new authority as he began connecting dots that exhaustion and emotional trauma had previously hidden from view. Whitmore's responses became increasingly evasive, technical explanations giving way to vague generalities and promises to investigate further. Behavior that felt more like damage control than genuine confusion about market conditions. The phone call ended with polite assurances and promises of additional documentation, but the subtext was clear. Questions were unwelcome, outside perspectives were irrelevant, and further inquiry would be viewed as betrayal rather than prudence. The diner felt charged with potential energy after Whitmore disconnected. Fluorescent lights humming overhead like electrical anticipation as Sterling stared at his documents with new eyes that saw conspiracy where he'd previously accepted explanation. Sage found herself caught between triumph and terror, professional satisfaction at identifying genuine financial irregularities competing with working-class anxiety about the consequences of challenging powerful people who clearly didn't appreciate scrutiny from unexpected sources. The other customers continued their late-night routines oblivious to the drama unfolding in Booth 7, their conversations about sports and weather providing surreal background to what felt like the opening moves of corporate warfare. Sterling's Mont Blanc pen lay abandoned next to the bankruptcy papers like a sword beside a fallen warrior, its expensive weight suddenly seeming less like a tool of surrender and more like a weapon waiting to be reclaimed. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but neither of them moved to leave, both understanding that they'd stumbled onto something larger than individual financial crisis, something that required investigation rather than resignation, courage rather than compliance, alliance rather than solitary struggle against forces designed to crush anyone who dared question their authority or competence. Dawn broke over San Francisco like a reluctant witness to conspiracy. Pale light filtering through diner windows as Sage and Sterling formed an unlikely partnership born from necessity rather than choice. Two people from different worlds united by shared recognition that powerful forces were manipulating truth for profitable ends. Sterling's initial skepticism about accepting help from a community college student dissolved as Sage demonstrated analytical capabilities that rivaled his expensive consultants. Her working-class education providing practical skills that complemented his theoretical business knowledge in ways that felt almost cosmically appropriate. The investigation began with basic fact-checking that revealed disturbing patterns, patent filings that had mysteriously changed hands, licensing agreements that had been quietly terminated, market research reports that painted artificially pessimistic pictures of Cybernexus's technological value. Each discovery felt like pulling threads from a tapestry, revealing the careful construction of Sterling's downfall through systematic manipulation of information that only someone with intimate knowledge of his business could have orchestrated. The scope of deception required coordination between multiple parties, suggesting conspiracy rather than coincidence, deliberate sabotage rather than market forces. Sage's photographic memory for numbers proved invaluable as they reconstructed the timeline of Cybernexus's apparent decline. Her ability to recall specific figures from documents she'd only glimpsed, allowing them to identify patterns that spreadsheets and databases had somehow failed to capture. The financial irregularities followed logical progressions that suggested careful planning rather than random occurrence. Assets being systematically undervalued, while liabilities were inflated according to schedules that benefited specific parties at predictable intervals. "Look at these dates," Sage pointed out, her finger tracing connections between seemingly unrelated events that revealed underlying coordination when viewed chronologically. Patent challenges had been filed just days before major contract negotiations. Technical difficulties had emerged precisely when licensing deals required renewal. Market analysts had published negative reports within hours of positive Cybernexus announcements, creating artificial volatility that justified dramatic asset revaluations. The pattern was elegant in its sophistication, a masterpiece of financial manipulation that had escaped detection because it operated within legal boundaries while achieving illegal objectives through accumulated legitimate actions. The TechRise connection emerged like a smoking gun in a murder investigation. Corporate filings revealing that their breakthrough quantum computing announcement relied heavily on algorithms that Cybernexus had developed years earlier but somehow lost control of through licensing agreements that no one at Sterling's company remembered signing. Phoenix Blackwell's company had positioned itself to benefit enormously from Cybernexus's collapse, acquiring undervalued assets through bankruptcy proceedings while simultaneously launching products based on intellectual property that should have remained protected under existing patents. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, the coordination too precise to be accidental, the financial benefits too overwhelming to ignore as possible motive for systematic corporate destruction. Sterling's hands shook as he realized the magnitude of betrayal involved. Not just legal manipulation, but personal violation by people he'd trusted with his life's work. Colleagues who'd shared meals at his table while planning his professional execution with surgical precision and sociopathic dedication. Whitmore's role became clearer as they traced financial transactions that revealed his law firm's unusually close relationship with companies that stood to benefit from Cybernexus's dissolution. Legal fees that seemed disproportionately large for standard bankruptcy proceedings, and consulting agreements that created obvious conflicts of interest but had been structured to appear legitimate under cursory examination. The lawyer had positioned himself as both Sterling's advocate and his destroyer, offering solutions that created problems while problems that generated solutions. A professional Ouroboros that consumed its client while appearing to serve his interests. Bank records showed payments from TechRise to Whitmore's firm for consulting services that had begun months before Cybernexus's financial difficulties became apparent, suggesting the conspiracy had been planned and funded well in advance of its execution. The legal structure was brilliant in its cynicism, using Sterling's trust and professional relationships to facilitate his own destruction while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved in the systematic theft of his intellectual property and corporate assets. Sage's family experience with restaurant bankruptcy provided unexpected insights into legal procedures that Sterling's wealth had previously insulated him from understanding. Her grandmother's warnings about lawyers who created problems they then charged to solve proving prophetic in corporate contexts that operated by similar predatory principles. "When they start talking about inevitability," Sage observed, channeling working-class wisdom earned through generations of economic hardship, "that's when you know they're selling something that benefits them more than you." The comment struck Sterling with the force of revelation, recontextualizing months of legal advice that had felt supportive but had systematically eliminated alternatives while making surrender seem prudent rather than premature. Her ability to translate complex financial manipulation into human terms gave him new vocabulary for understanding his situation. Working-class skepticism of authority, providing analytical frameworks that his privileged background had never developed because he'd never needed protection from people who shared his social status and professional credentials. The evidence mounted with each hour of investigation, documents and phone records painting a picture of coordinated corporate assassination that had been months in preparation and flawless in execution until Sage's accidental intervention disrupted carefully laid plans. Sterling's Mont Blanc pen, abandoned since her first observation about the patent discrepancies, had become a symbol of reclaimed agency rather than surrender, its expensive weight representing the power to fight back rather than simply accept defeat. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like electronic approval of their partnership. Two minds working in synchronization to unravel deception that had nearly succeeded through its victims' isolation and despair. Coffee cups multiplied on the table like archaeological layers of their investigation. Evidence of hours spent reconstructing corporate crime that operated within legal boundaries while achieving criminal objectives through accumulated legitimate actions. The morning shift employees arrived to find them hunched over documents like scholars decoding ancient texts, their intensity suggesting either breakthrough discovery or complete breakdown. The fluorescent-lit booth transformed into a war room where David prepared to face multiple Goliaths armed with nothing but truth and righteous indignation. The plan took shape over bitter coffee and shared determination. Two minds operating in dangerous synchronization as they plotted infiltration that could either save Sterling's empire or destroy Sage's carefully constructed life in ways that extended far beyond immediate employment concerns. Sterling's remaining corporate connections provided access to information networks that Sage's working-class background made invisible to security systems, her apparent insignificance becoming tactical advantage in environments designed to monitor threats from peer-level competitors rather than service industry observers. The strategy required Sage to penetrate Whitmore's law firm during late-night cleaning hours, when skeleton crews and minimal supervision would allow her to photograph documents that could provide definitive proof of the conspiracy they'd uncovered through circumstantial evidence and logical deduction. Risk assessment felt academic until it became personal. Sterling faced financial ruin, while Sage confronted potential criminal charges for corporate espionage. But both understood that inaction guaranteed outcomes worse than the consequences of exposure and resistance. The inequality of their respective stakes created complex dynamics that neither acknowledged directly, but both felt acutely privilege and poverty approaching justice through different doors that led to the same destination. Sage's transformation from diner waitress to corporate spy required costume changes that felt like theatrical preparation for a performance where mistakes could result in prison rather than poor reviews. Her paint-stained apron exchanged for generic cleaning service uniforms that rendered her invisible to security cameras and executive assumptions. The false employment credentials Sterling arranged through remaining business contacts gave her legitimate access to spaces where her normal social position would have triggered immediate suspicion. Working-class camouflage, providing cover for middle-class espionage in corporate environments designed to exclude people like her from meaningful participation. Her nervous energy channeled into methodical preparation as they rehearsed scenarios and practiced explanations for her presence in areas where cleaning staff typically weren't allowed. Every detail planned with military precision because improvisation could expose them both to legal consequences that would end careers and potentially freedom. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that she was using her authentic working-class identity to gain access to privileged information. Economic marginalization becoming tactical advantage in warfare between corporate titans who'd never considered service workers as potential threats to their carefully constructed schemes. Whitmore's law firm occupied 3 floors of a downtown high-rise that spoke of old money and older power. Marble lobbies and mahogany panels designed to intimidate clients while reassuring them of professional competence that justified premium billing rates for services that sometimes prioritized legal fees over client interests. Sage's evening shift began at 10 p.m. with legitimate cleaning responsibilities that provided cover for her actual mission. Industrial vacuum cleaners and commercial disinfectants, masking the sound of camera phones documenting evidence that could unravel months of careful planning and coordination. The building's after-hours atmosphere felt charged with secrets and suppressed guilt. Empty offices containing enough documentary evidence to destroy reputations and end careers if discovered by someone with both intelligence to understand their significance and courage to act on uncomfortable knowledge. Security guards made periodic rounds with clockwork predictability that allowed Sage to time her movements between legitimate cleaning tasks and illicit photography, her heart pounding with adrenaline that made simple tasks feel monumentally significant while routine activities became covers for potentially life-changing espionage. The discovery came in Whitmore's personal office, where unlocked filing cabinets revealed correspondence that laid out the conspiracy in explicit detail. Emails and contracts that demonstrated premeditated corporate assassination with smoking gun clarity that eliminated all possibility of coincidence or misunderstanding. Phoenix Blackwell's communications with Whitmore detailed asset acquisition strategies that depended on Cybernexus bankruptcy, profit-sharing agreements that incentivized Sterling's complete financial destruction, and timeline schedules that coordinated market manipulation with legal proceedings for maximum efficiency and minimum detectability. The documents felt radioactive in their implications, evidence so damaging that possession alone could trigger dangerous reactions from people with enough power and desperation to silence inconvenient witnesses through methods that might extend beyond legal intimidation. Sage's hands trembled as she photographed each page. Community college education providing sufficient legal knowledge to recognize that she was documenting felony conspiracy while potentially committing related felonies herself. Academic abstractions becoming personal reality with each camera click. Whitmore's sudden appearance in his office doorway felt like cardiac arrest made manifest. His silhouette backlit by hallway fluorescence, creating dramatic shadows that transformed routine surprise into cinematic menace with almost supernatural timing. "Fascinating reading material," he observed with the calm that predators use before striking. His voice carrying undertones that suggested this encounter wasn't accidental, but carefully orchestrated to catch her in circumstances that would justify whatever responses he'd already planned. Sage's mind raced through possible explanations for her presence in areas where cleaning staff had no legitimate business, but Whitmore's smile suggested he wasn't interested in plausible deniability or reasonable doubt, but in demonstrating the consequences of challenging authority that operated beyond conventional legal constraints. The filing cabinet stood open behind her, like evidence of guilt that couldn't be explained away. Camera phone in her pocket containing information that could destroy him, but only if she survived long enough to deliver it to people who would act on uncomfortable knowledge, rather than suppress it for their own protection and continued prosperity. The threats began immediately, but felt almost conversational in their delivery. Whitmore's tone suggesting that destroying her life would be professionally satisfying rather than personally regrettable. Business transaction rather than moral choice that might trouble his conscience or sleep patterns. "Young women in your position face such precarious circumstances," he mused with false sympathy that couldn't disguise underlying menace. Implications about her family's immigration history and employment status creating vulnerability that extended beyond immediate physical danger. His knowledge of her personal details felt like violation, research that suggested surveillance and preparation rather than improvised intimidation. Threats calibrated to exploit specific fears rather than general anxiety about consequences. The conversation became psychological warfare where words carried weight of institutional power, capable of crushing individual resistance through legal mechanisms designed to protect people like him from people like her. Class warfare disguised as professional courtesy that maintained polite surface tensions while promising destruction that would appear accidental rather than deliberate to outside observers. Sterling's response to Sage's capture crystallized their partnership into something deeper than convenience. His decision to prioritize her safety over his corporate survival revealing character that wealth hadn't entirely corrupted despite decades of privilege that typically insulated people from moral complexity requiring personal sacrifice. The choice felt monumental in its simplicity. Abandon the investigation to protect someone who'd risked everything to help him, or continue pursuing justice while knowing that his actions could destroy an innocent person whose only crime was possessing inconvenient intelligence and moral courage. His immediate concern for Sage's well-being surprised them both. Genuine human connection transcending class boundaries that had previously seemed insurmountable. Shared danger creating bonds that social conditioning had trained them to believe were impossible between people from such different economic circumstances. The billionaire's protective instincts toward a working-class waitress challenged assumptions about human nature that both had absorbed through cultural programming about who mattered and who was expendable in American power structures designed to maintain existing hierarchies through carefully constructed indifference to individual dignity. Sage's family history emerged in fragments as they planned their response to Whitmore's escalating threats. Irish immigration stories that paralleled countless American dreams built on stubborn determination and refusal to accept defeat when powerful forces demanded submission from people whose only weapons were intelligence and integrity. Her great-grandparents had fled economic desperation in Cork during the 1920s, carrying nothing but willingness to work impossible hours for minimal wages while building foundations that would eventually support generations of descendants who achieved modest prosperity through accumulated sacrifice and strategic education. The family restaurant had represented 3 generations of American dreaming, a small business that had employed dozens of community members while providing gathering space for neighborhood celebrations and sorrows, destroyed by corporate competition and economic forces that had crushed local businesses with systematic efficiency that felt personal even when it was merely profitable. Her grandfather's lesson about standing up to bullies regardless of their size or influence had been reinforced by watching her grandmother manage family finances through economic crises that would have broken weaker spirits or less determined personalities. Whitmore's investigation firm represented corporate intimidation elevated to art form. Private investigators who specialized in finding pressure points that could be exploited legally while maintaining plausible deniability about their clients' intentions or methods for achieving desired outcomes through technically legitimate harassment. Their background checks had penetrated Sage's life with surgical precision, identifying family vulnerabilities that could be weaponized against anyone who possessed inconvenient knowledge about wealthy people's illegal activities or unethical business practices. The threats felt personal despite their professional delivery. Implications about her younger brother's college financial aid and her elderly grandmother's Social Security benefits creating anxiety that extended beyond immediate physical safety into long-term family stability. Economic terrorism disguised as legal research. Psychological warfare that attacked support systems rather than direct confrontation. Sophisticated intimidation that recognized working-class families' greatest fears involved systemic exclusion from institutions that middle-class people took for granted as permanently accessible regardless of political or legal difficulties they might encounter. Sterling's remaining corporate allies provided unexpected resources for fighting back against coordinated destruction. Old friendships and professional relationships that had survived his apparent downfall because they were based on genuine respect rather than mere financial benefit or strategic networking opportunities. Media contacts who owed him favors from previous exclusive access to breakthrough technologies agreed to investigate corruption allegations that would generate attention regardless of their resolution. Publicity becoming protective mechanism because public scrutiny made elimination more difficult for people who preferred operating in shadows. Tech industry connections provided platforms for exposing corporate conspiracy to audiences who understood the implications of intellectual property theft and systematic market manipulation. Professional communities that had their own interests in maintaining fair competition rather than allowing criminal coordination to determine market outcomes. The strategy required careful timing and precise execution. Media revelations coordinated with legal filings to maximize impact while minimizing opportunities for damage control or evidence destruction that could neutralize their carefully gathered proof of criminal conspiracy. The 48-hour countdown created urgency that sharpened their focus while intensifying pressure that threatened to overwhelm careful planning with desperate improvisation that could destroy everything they'd worked to preserve and protect. Bankruptcy papers waited for Sterling's signature like execution warrants. Legal documents that would transfer his life's work to conspirators who'd manipulated circumstances to acquire valuable assets for fractions of their actual worth, while destroying the creator's reputation and financial security. Each hour brought new threats and escalating intimidation as Whitmore recognized that his carefully constructed plan was unraveling through exposure that threatened not just specific crimes, but entire networks of corruption that connected his law firm to multiple ongoing schemes involving other victims and other companies. Sage's working-class stubbornness met Sterling's billionaire determination in partnership that felt cosmically appropriate. 2 forms of American persistence uniting against institutional corruption that had grown confident through historical success in crushing individual resistance before it could organize into effective opposition. Their alliance had evolved beyond mutual benefit into genuine friendship that transcended economic circumstances and social conditioning that typically prevented authentic relationships between people from such different backgrounds and life experiences. Coffee-stained documents spread across the diner table like battle plans drawn by unlikely generals. Evidence of corporate crime accumulated through partnership that proved intelligence and integrity weren't monopolized by people who could afford expensive educations or inherited advantages. The Mont Blanc pen had become their shared symbol of resistance. Expensive instrument of surrender transformed into weapon for justice through collaborative effort that demonstrated how individual talents could combine to challenge institutional power when properly focused and courageously applied. Dawn approached like reinforcement arriving for a final battle, natural light replacing fluorescent illumination as if the universe was preparing to witness justice served by people who refused to accept defeat when truth was on their side, and courage was their primary asset against forces that had grown complacent through historical success in suppressing inconvenient opposition. The final pieces of Whitmore's conspiracy fell into place with devastating clarity as Sage's financial analysis revealed patterns that stretched back 2 years. Systematic preparation for Sterling's destruction planned with clockwork precision that suggested obsessive attention to detail and sociopathic patience in executing long-term strategies for personal enrichment through systematic betrayal. The lawyer had positioned himself not just as Sterling's legal counsel, but as architect of his downfall, using intimate knowledge of cybernexus operations to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited through carefully timed market manipulation and strategic relationship sabotage. Email timestamps showed coordination between Whitmore, Phoenix Blackwell, and several board members who had agreed to facilitate the takeover in exchange for lucrative positions in the new corporate structure that would emerge from Cybernexus's ashes. The conspiracy wasn't opportunistic, but premeditated corporate murder, assassination disguised as business strategy that had required months of careful planning and coordination between multiple parties who had sworn loyalty while plotting destruction with surgical precision and breathtaking cynicism. Phoenix Blackwell's partnership with Whitmore revealed itself through financial documents that showed profit-sharing agreements contingent on Cybernexus's complete destruction, success bonuses that incentivized thorough rather than partial demolition of Sterling's empire through bankruptcy proceedings that would eliminate potential future competition. The TechRise CEO had provided inside information about patent challenges and market research that had allowed Whitmore to time legal actions for maximum disruption of Sterling's business relationships, while Blackwell's company had prepared to acquire undervalued assets through bankruptcy auctions that were essentially prearranged sales disguised as legitimate liquidation procedures. Their communications revealed casual discussion of Sterling's emotional deterioration as beneficial factor in accelerating timeline. Predator psychology that viewed human suffering as tactical advantage rather than moral concern that might complicate their collaborative enrichment through systematic theft and professional assassination. The cold calculation in their planning documents felt like reading serial killer correspondence, business language disguising psychological warfare that had been designed to destroy not just financial assets, but human dignity and emotional stability through methodical isolation and betrayal. Board members had been recruited through combination of blackmail and bribery that Whitmore had orchestrated with the thoroughness of intelligence operations, using private investigators to discover personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited to guarantee cooperation when votes were needed to facilitate Sterling's removal from his own company. Jasper Ryland's gambling debts had made him susceptible to financial pressure, while other directors faced potential exposure for various professional indiscretions that Whitmore's research had uncovered through systematic surveillance and investigation. The corruption network extended throughout Cybernexus leadership, compromised individuals who had agreed to participate in Sterling's destruction rather than face personal consequences for past mistakes or current weaknesses that could be weaponized against them. The betrayal felt biblical in its scope. Trusted advisors and longtime colleagues revealing themselves as enemy agents who had spent months or years gathering intelligence that would eventually be used to destroy the man who had created their prosperity and professional success through innovations that had revolutionized entire industries. Sterling's hands trembled as he processed the magnitude of betrayal involved. Not just financial theft, but personal violation by people who had shared meals at his table while planning his destruction with meticulous attention to psychological warfare, designed to isolate him from support systems that might have provided protection against such comprehensive assault. The timeline showed escalating pressure applied at moments of maximum vulnerability. Crises manufactured to coincide with personal stress that would impair his judgment and decision-making capacity, while creating desperation that made surrender seem reasonable rather than premature. His trust in professional relationships had been weaponized against him. Loyalty and friendship exploited as character weaknesses rather than strengths. Human connections transformed into tactical disadvantages that facilitated manipulation through emotional exploitation. The realization that his own generosity and faith in people had been used to orchestrate his downfall added psychological torture to financial destruction. Betrayal that attacked his fundamental beliefs about human nature and business relationships that had been built on assumptions of mutual respect and shared ethical boundaries. Sage watched Sterling process the evidence with combination of sympathy and analytical detachment. Her working-class background providing immunity to surprise about wealthy people's capacity for cruelty when their interests were threatened or profit opportunities presented themselves. Her grandmother's warnings about trusting people whose comfort depended on others' suffering had prepared her for revelations that devastated Sterling's worldview but confirmed her family's cynical wisdom about power relationships and economic competition that recognized no moral boundaries when significant money was involved. The documents told familiar story in unfamiliar context. Predatory behavior that poor people experienced routinely, but that Sterling's privilege had insulated him from until circumstances made him vulnerable to exploitation that operated at higher financial levels but followed identical psychological patterns. Her ability to maintain emotional equilibrium while processing evidence of systematic betrayal provided stabilizing influence that kept Sterling focused on solutions rather than despair. Working-class practicality offering framework for understanding corruption without being paralyzed by moral outrage that could prevent effective response. The accelerated timeline revealed Whitmore's growing panic as he realized his carefully constructed plan was unraveling through exposure that threatened not just specific conspiracy, but his entire career and potential freedom if criminal charges resulted from documented evidence of fraud and corporate espionage. Emergency phone calls had been placed to co-conspirators warning of security breaches that required immediate damage control. Communications that revealed nervous desperation replacing confident calculation as investigation threatened to expose networks of corruption that extended beyond Cybernexus into other companies and other victims. The lawyers scrambled to destroy evidence while advancing bankruptcy timeline, hoping to complete theft before exposure could prevent final transfer of assets that would justify years of careful planning and patient execution, racing against time that had suddenly become their enemy rather than tactical advantage. Conspirators who had controlled every variable now faced chaos introduced by factors they had never considered. Working-class intelligence and moral courage that refused to be intimidated by threats or bought with promises of participation in profitable schemes that required complicity in destroying innocent people's lives and careers through systematic betrayal and coordinated theft. The emergency board meeting convened at dawn like a tribunal, where justice would finally confront corruption. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as if the building itself was nervous about the revelations that would shortly transform corporate boardroom into courtroom where evidence would determine whether truth or money would prevail in battle that had consumed months of planning and execution by all involved parties. Sage entered the mahogany-paneled conference room with quiet confidence that her working-class background had taught her to project when facing hostile audiences who expected intimidation or submission from people they considered social inferiors or intellectual inadequates. Her community college education and diner experience had prepared her for moments when intelligence would be tested by people who assumed she lacked capability or credibility necessary to challenge their authority or expertise in matters they considered beyond her comprehension. The documents she carried contained enough evidence to destroy careers and trigger criminal investigations, but their power depended entirely on her ability to present complex financial information with clarity and conviction that would overcome prejudices about her background and qualifications to interpret sophisticated corporate crimes. The board members' faces registered shock as Sage methodically presented evidence that revealed their colleagues' betrayal and their own vulnerability to prosecution for participating in conspiracy that extended far beyond simple business disagreement into criminal territory that would interest federal investigators and Justice Department prosecutors. Whitmore's attempts at damage control grew increasingly desperate as each document she displayed eliminated another excuse or explanation for behavior that looked increasingly like organized crime, disguised as legitimate business strategy designed to steal intellectual property through systematic manipulation of legal proceedings. Phoenix Blackwell participated via conference call with growing anxiety audible in voice that had lost its earlier confidence as evidence mounted of coordinated effort to destroy competitor through methods that violated both federal laws and professional ethics standards. The presentation built momentum like avalanche gathering speed, each revelation adding weight to accusations that transformed from allegations into documented facts that demanded institutional response regardless of personal relationships or financial consequences for individuals involved in conspiracy. Sterling's vindication came through Sage's professional competence rather than his own advocacy, working-class intelligence providing credibility that his billionaire status might have undermined if he had presented identical evidence to audience predisposed to dismiss claims from someone facing financial ruin as desperate attempt to avoid personal responsibility for business failure. Her analysis connected dots that expensive consultants and professional investigators had somehow missed. Systematic patterns visible to someone whose accounting education had taught her to question assumptions and verify claims rather than accept authority based on social position or professional credentials. The board members' grudging respect for her capabilities grew as presentation continued, class-based prejudices dissolving under weight of competence that demanded acknowledgement regardless of personal comfort with admitting they had been outmaneuvered by someone they would never have considered intellectual equal or credible threat to their carefully constructed schemes. Justice served by unexpected messenger. Truth delivered by person whose background had trained them to recognize corruption that privileged people often missed because they benefited from systems designed to protect their interests while exploiting others. Whitmore's arrest came within hours of the board meeting's conclusion. Federal agents armed with warrants that had been prepared based on evidence that Sage and Sterling had compiled through their investigation of financial irregularities and documentary proof of conspiracy to commit fraud. The lawyer's professional composure cracked completely as handcuffs clicked around wrists that had signed documents authorizing theft disguised as legitimate legal advice. His protests about prosecutorial overreach falling on deaf ears of investigators who had seen enough white-collar crime to recognize sophisticated schemes when presented with clear evidence of criminal intent and coordinated execution. Phoenix Blackwell's office was simultaneously raided by a separate team of agents who discovered additional evidence of corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. Communications that revealed network of corruption extending throughout tech industry where similar schemes had targeted other entrepreneurs and innovative companies. The conspiracy's exposure triggered broader investigation into patterns of predatory behavior that had operated with impunity until accidentally discovered through combination of working-class vigilance and billionaire resources focused on pursuit of justice rather than revenge or personal enrichment. Sterling's reinstatement as Cybernex's CEO came through board vote that acknowledged his innocence while recognizing institutional liability for failing to detect conspiracy that had operated within their oversight for nearly 2 years without triggering concern or investigation from people paid to protect shareholder interests. The offer to hire Sage as chief financial officer represented both personal gratitude and professional recognition of capabilities that had saved company worth billions of dollars through individual initiative and moral courage that institutional systems had failed to provide or protect. Her decision to decline executive position while accepting consulting contract represented working-class wisdom about maintaining independence rather than becoming dependent on gratitude that might fade when memory of crisis diminished with time and changing circumstances. The consulting firm she established would focus on helping small businesses protect themselves from predatory practices that larger companies routinely use to eliminate competition or acquire assets below fair market value, through legal manipulation and systematic intimidation designed to overwhelm individual resistance with institutional power. The Mont Blanc pen that Sterling pressed into Sage's hand carried symbolic weight beyond its material value. Expensive instrument transformed from weapon of surrender into trophy commemorating victory achieved through partnership that transcended economic boundaries and social conditioning that typically prevented authentic collaboration between people from different class backgrounds. Her acceptance of the gift acknowledged both their friendship and her transformation from invisible service worker into visible force for justice, who would use newfound platform to protect others facing similar exploitation from people who believed wealth provided immunity from moral accountability or legal consequences. The pen would write new stories about working-class intelligence, challenging institutional corruption, truth defeating money when courage and competence combined to expose schemes that depended on victims' isolation and investigators' assumptions about who possessed credibility necessary to challenge authority. Dawn light filtered through conference room windows like divine approval of justice served. Natural illumination replacing artificial fluorescence, as if universe was celebrating triumph of human decency over systematic greed that had nearly succeeded through sophistication and patience, but had ultimately failed because it underestimated both working-class determination and moral courage that refused to accept defeat when truth was on their side. The victory belonged to everyone who had ever been dismissed because of their background, overlooked because of their position, or underestimated because of assumptions about intelligence and capability that privilege used to maintain power through carefully constructed indifference to individual dignity and potential. In a world where power and money often silence the truth, it takes unlikely heroes to restore justice. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from, because stories of courage against corruption resonate everywhere, and sometimes the most important battles are won by those society least expects to fight.